Series entitled CZ, Critical Zone and Society. Today, Jon Pelletier will speak to us about his modeling efforts and focused on Earth surface processes and hazards using CZ science. Jon is a professor in the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arizona. And importantly for our community, he's one of the co-investigators with John Chorover on the Catalina Jemez CZO. Jon is somewhat unique in that he's a physicist, at least early in his career. He got his bachelor's of science in physics at Caltech and then went to do his PhD in geological sciences at Cornell. I was impressed to see he has, if I counted properly, 97 publications, including a book published by Cambridge University Press in 2008 entitled Quantitative Modeling of Earth's Surface Processes. And what I know of Jon is that his focus is on computer modeling and integrating model results with field data and also remotely sensed data. And he applies those to a variety of subdisciplines in geomorphology. And I also saw, looking at his papers, that he's done a little bit of work on surface processes on Mars, and he's dabbled in climate science too. So, Jon.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thanks to Sarah for helping with the technical and logistical aspects of this talk and the whole series. So in this title slide, I've included a conceptual model from Brotherton 1985 and of the entire Earth system. And so for my purposes, I just want to focus your attention on the center of that diagram, which has soil development as a key component to the Earth system. And so the main point here is that it's surprising to learn, as I did a few years ago, that Earth system models, which are not the only framework for forecasting to Earth, but they're the primary framework by which we do that forecasting. They assume a globally uniform depth to bedrock everywhere on the Earth, irrespective of geology or climate or topography. And so despite the fact that soil development, and more broadly, one can include the development of the deep critical zone architecture, fractured bedrock and weathered bedrock, those details have not, well, they're not details. Those parts of what we study as critical zone scientists have not, or are just beginning to percolate into the leading framework of Earth system modeling for doing forecasting. So I want to talk in this webinar about opportunities for better collaboration or more collaboration between Earth system modelers and the critical zone science community. And I'm going to be taking in examples from not just traditional critical zone science, so we'll be talking about dust emissions and air quality and examples like that. And I hope the breadth is something that people appreciate. So just to go into a little bit more detail about the Earth system modeling, this is from a hydrologic perspective. This is a slide courtesy of my colleague Peter Hazenberg, who's trying to introduce additional realism in the hydrology of Earth system models. And so he's identified some key simplifications of existing Earth system models, including CLM 4.5, which is the state-of-the-art model, including globally uniform soil thickness, simple representations of base flow generation, no horizontal movement of water that is resolved in these graded data sets, or these graded models, and the lack of a two-way interaction between the hill slope and the river network. Essentially, water can flow in one direction only, and as Peter has noted, it's not explicitly modeled in terms of the horizontal movement. So all of these are opportunities for the critical zone community. In this case, it's a hydrologic focus, but all of these are opportunities for the critical zone community to inform the next generation of Earth system models. So this talk is based in part, I've been thinking about this issue for a number of years, and this talk is based in part on a review paper that was published in 2015 in Earth's Future. So I'll just direct you to that paper for some additional reading if you're interested. In particular, there's a supplement, PDF supplement, that goes into quite a bit of detail on what we consider, this group of authors considered to be both the success stories and also the needs, the research needs. In terms of this case, it was more geomorphically focused, but how do we make site-specific forecasts of geomorphic change into the future? And so a key idea of that paper was that global gridded forecasts, and by gridded I mean relatively easy to use, global gridded forecasts of climatic and land use changes are available, and they're constantly improving from the Earth system modeling community. But they're relatively underutilized by scientists studying the surface and the near surface. And so in this context, that's critical zone science. And so I think there are opportunities for improved collaboration. That's the main idea from this talk. And so one can break that down a little bit more in a little bit more detail and make a distinction between one activity, which is using Earth system model forecasts as input to critical zone response models to determine the impacts of the critical zone and the impacts to the critical zone and the risks of natural hazards associated with the critical zone. And I'll talk about what those natural hazards are. So that's really a one-way communication where the Earth system model output is used essentially to downscale and derive what you might call value-added products that do things like make assessments of critical zone variables, states, and the natural hazards associated with those variables. And so I'll give you a number of examples to make this more explicit in a few minutes. Another activity might be developing improved input data for critical zone properties. And so here the example might be, I can invoke the same example I had before. These Earth system models are using generally uniform soil thickness across the globe. And so, can we as a critical zone community derive better input data sets that honor the spatial heterogeneity of the system, the portion of the system that we're expert in particular, the soil system, and one can extend that also to thinking about things like how vegetation influences boundary layer, atmospheric physics, for example. And also to develop a two-way coupling, we can introduce improved process models. So, there are things that are currently done in Earth system models that don't have a process representation. Can we develop process models that can actually plug and play with Earth system models? That's ultimately, I think, what we want to do. So just a couple of points that are related to this. One is that I take a broad view of forecasting, including the usefulness of forecasting signs of change. And by that I mean, if you're interested in air quality, for example, you might really want to know in 2100 the average number of days of non-attainment for PM 2.5 federal standards at a particular place on the Earth's surface. So that'd be a fairly specific, hard forecast. But it's fair to say that in many cases, when it comes to these kinds of forecasts, we really can only say something about the sign of change, and even then there might be uncertainty. To me, that's not a failure of the forecast. If you can say something about whether a given region on the Earth's surface is going to be dustier in the future or less dusty, I think there's value in that. So that's what I mean by a sign of change. And the second point that overarches the whole talk here is that any model that produces a forecast must be shown to be useful, it has to be tested, or if you prefer, validated. And typically this is done via some successful Hindcast. So in other words, you take forcing data for the last 30 years of instrumental record, and you show that your model reproduces some aspect of that in a successful way. Or you can do a short-term forecast. You can forecast something for the next few years and then test that forecast in real time. So those are the kinds of things. That's a necessary condition for any type of forecast, is a successful Hindcast. And so that might be a point of discussion later, is what should those Hindcasts look like, and how many models do we really have that can do that at the present time. So in this slide, I just wanted to go into a little bit more detail about the kinds of forcing variables that are output by Earth system modelers and the kinds of things that we are interested in. So on the bottom of this slide, this is again a fairly geomorphic perspective, but I've broken up the Earth's surface into different process zones: hill slope fluvial, periglacial, aeolian, coastal, and their associated hazards. These are things that we'd really like to know are these hazards going to get worse or better, and and what is the spatial variability of how that hazard might change in the future. And the primary forcings up on top are things that I think Earth system models do quite well, at least at particular spatial and temporal scales. Maybe not at the spatial and temporal scales that we might want, but at certain spatial and temporal scales, temperature is quite robust across the ensemble of climate models and Earth system models. Precipitation is more uncertain, particularly when you get to things like thunderstorms that may represent sub-grid scale variability within an Earth system model. But I think we can say something. There are robust predictions that are being made about the intensity of precipitation and how that might vary across the globe that I think are correct and robust and are being shown to have successful hindcasting ability. Wind speed obviously is going to force something like dune behavior, and then land use. So temperature, precipitation, wind, and land use. I think all of these, I have some level of confidence that Earth system models are predicting these successfully out into the future. And they're always improving over time, those forecasts. But many of the things that we're interested in require additional levels of sophistication that may not be in Earth system models right now. So the point of this slide is really to highlight this secondary forcings in the middle. This is really an attempt to identify linkages that may need to be made more explicitly in Earth system models. And in particular, runoff and soil moisture is not particularly well done, not done in a sophisticated way, yet that's crucial for things like predicting pore pressure, which is essential for predicting landslide susceptibility, for example. Land cover is really the vegetation response to climate, including things like CO2 fertilization and that effect. That are not fully known. So there are ecosystem demography models that ultimately influence land cover, and there are uncertainties associated with those. And then if you're interested in the coastal zone, then you need to do things like, make predictions about the distribution of wave heights, which isn't currently being done in our system models that may require, an additional model to be coupled. So part of the point of this slide is that we're going to be coupling models at a variety of scales to do this kind of forecasting that I'm describing. And some of that can be done offline, just using primary forcings out to say 2100 and using a coupled set of models to make predictions about specific sites at high resolution using very good data we have for topography, for example, SRTM, 90-meter topography. And some of those will require fully coupled models within our system models. So just to give you some examples of what I consider to be useful forecasts of critical zone properties and hazards associated with the critical zone. This one is quite old. This is from 2001, Nelson et al. And what was being done here was to identify in a sort of a classification scheme areas of periglacial terrain where the permafrost was likely to degrade and lead to subsidence threatening infrastructure like oil pipelines and buildings and things like that. This is an example of a soft prediction in the sense that these modelers are not trying to predict the exact value, in units of length of subsidence as a function of time. What they're really just trying to do is identify areas that are at higher risk for land subsidence, taking into account, using the inputs of temperature change as a function of time, as a function of space, which in temperature change is quite well done in these Earth system models, and using that in conjunction with the fact that there is this critical threshold in the periglacial system that if the mean annual temperature goes above 0 degrees centigrade, then permafrost begins to degrade in a significant way. And so it's using that fairly simple threshold shift combined with input from Earth system models to make predictions about the relative levels of degradation that might be expected and risk associated with that permafrost degradation. I would call this something like a hotspot map. So it's basically a way of identifying, all around the world, which areas are the most susceptible to this particular process or hazard. And this type of hotspot map, it can be useful, especially for focusing attention in particular areas, to make additional measurements or to do initial, more sophisticated monitoring work and to develop improved process models. So this is really a way of, I guess, focusing attention on a particular area with regard to a particular hazard. Another example that I'd like to draw your attention to is dust emissions. So air quality has a very direct influence on human health, and it's also a radiatively important aerosol. So when there's more dust in the air, the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth is not as, is significantly modified depending on PM2.5 concentrations in the atmosphere. So for that reason, dust emission, which I consider to be a critical zone process, has always been included in some level or another in the land surface component of Earth system models. And so two of the commonly used models right now are GOCART, which is on the right. This is from Genou et al., and DEAD, these are acronyms, from Zender et al. On the left. And so these models vary in their level of sophistication, but they're an example of a critical zone model that has that is fairly mature at this stage. They've gone through multiple iterations of these models, and they've been well tested in Hindcasts and in real-time forecasts using our system models in a fully coupled way. And one of the interesting things is that the GOCART model does not include any information at all about, it's not, the dust emission potential is not dynamic. It doesn't change through time at all. So as you change the shear stress based on atmospheric turbulence and the physics of the atmosphere, you can entrain more or less dust. But there's nothing about the surface itself that modulates through time that emission potential. DEAD is considered generally to be an improvement upon the GOCART model in that it uses vegetation cover, which is dynamic through time, as a way of modulating dust emission, primarily through leaf area index. But is that enough? So as critical zone scientists who are interested in aeolian processes, there's an opportunity, I think, to suggest process-based improvements to these models, or to suggest alternative models that can be tested. Getting a little bit closer to home, I think for many of the folks in the audience, landslides are a very direct critical zone hazard that is a function of soil parameters and soil processes. And so this is a model that based on Kirschbaum et al. 2009 that is now updated. So there's a dynamic version of this particular map that's updated every 30 minutes at the website that I've shown here on the slide. And so this is an example of a model that is used offline in conjunction with a real-time weather forecast to make assessments about landslide potential. And again, certainly no one can forecast, or if you prefer, predict when a landslide will occur at a specific point in time, just like we can't predict landslides. But we can say something about the potential for landslides based on both deterministic models and also probabilistic models that can be useful for mitigation and also for warning systems and things like that. So now the details, of course, from a scientific point of view, there are models that are more sophisticated and less sophisticated in terms of whether they're including the physics of any particular process. But the point here is that a lot of this kind of forecasting is already being done for processes that we care about. And so the question is, how can we make them as scientifically robust and mature as we possibly can? Just to go back in time to increase the time scale here a little bit, I wanted to introduce an example that is over geologic timescales. So critical zone scientists are interested in the evolution of the critical zone over geologic time, of course, and the geologic record provides some very useful opportunities for testing models that might be used in forecasts. Hindcasts, for example, that might successfully or unsuccessfully hindcast the behavior of Earth's surface to, say, the Pleistocene-Holocene transition, which was a huge climate transition across the world, and even here in the southwestern US, even though there's no glaciers, there was a big change in precipitation, temperature, and in vegetation cover. So in this slide, which is based on a paper that I wrote in 2014, I was trying to to develop a model that would hindcast and thereby help understand the response of fluvial systems to the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. So in the southwestern US, there was a fairly, from around 18,000 years before present to about 12,000 years before present, there was a fairly abrupt, so over about 6,000 years, there was a drying and a warming trend that took place over the central Mojave Desert. And so associated with that transition, we have a record of fluvial system response that includes aggradation. So there's basically a brand new fluvial, regionally correlative fluvial deposit that was laid down called the Q3A throughout the central Mojave Desert and beyond. And so scientists have been studying via optically stimulated luminescence the timing of that aggradation. And it turns out that it's very time transgressive. So one hypothesis is that these episodes of aggradation coincide with 18 to 12, that time period of major warming and drying. It turns out that that hypothesis is not supported by the data, however. In this particular model, I'm focusing on the response of the vegetation communities, and in particular, I'm focusing on the transition from a pinyon juniper forest to a shrubland. So this was a major transition in the hill slope vegetation cover, which post-dated the climate change. So the climate change was over by about 12,000 years before present, but at fairly high elevations, the forests were still transitioning into shrublands as late as 6,000 years before present, so into the mid-Holocene. And so in the lower left corner, I'm just showing a graph comparing model predicted aggradation timing to the OSL data as a function of the elevation of the aggrading sites. So what you can see in this graph is that both the model prediction and the data show that at relatively low elevation, this fluvial system aggradation occurs very early. It occurs close to 18,000 years before present. And then as you go higher and higher in elevation, both in the elevation of the fan itself and also the source region that's feeding that fan, you get progressively later, more time transgressive response. So some of the time lags in the fluvial system can be understood by thinking about vegetation changes and relating models to not just the climatic record, but also the paleovegetation record. So I consider this to be a reasonably successful hindcast of the fluvial response to climatic changes, in this case over geologic timescales. This is an example from Goderies and Brantley, 2015. So in this particular case, they were trying to understand how changes in weathering, and in this particular case, they were quantifying the depth of carbonate dissolution, might change as a function of time due to changes both in the climatic drivers, the vegetation response to that climate, and also the carbon system within soils, which are, of course, responsive to CO2 in the atmosphere. So in this case, they're predicting the retreat of the terrestrial lysocline, and this is for a particular pedon that they were modeling, both backward in time to 1960 through hindcasting, and also forward in time to 2100. And so I'm not sure how this is a fairly subtle change in the soil development. I'm not sure how this would be validated against data, since it's a fairly difficult thing to measure. But I think they're predicting, what I like about this particular example is the cascade of climate, biospheric, and weathering models that was used that can help to identify positive and negative feedbacks in the system. And certainly going forward in time, there's a prediction of a significantly lower retreat rate. And so if this can be detected in data, it would be, I think, a successful real-time forecast. I want to talk about this sixth example in a little bit more detail, because this is something that I've been involved in, and I think it goes back to the initial motivation for the talk, which was how do we better reproduce or represent, the critical zone architecture in our system models. So the goal here is to improve the characterization of the subsurface architecture for our system models, and this is based on some work that I did last year. And so the conceptual model for that particular paper was think about both the upland and the lowland subsurface architecture as a sequence of layers, and those layers included a relatively high permeable layer, which in upland terrain is what we typically call a soil and is a few meters deep, typically at most. And in lowlands includes sedimentary deposits of various kinds, including alluvial deposits, that can be hundreds and even thousands of meters thick. In uplands, so the portion of the landscape shown on the right, below the soil layer is this very important layer of intact regolith. This is the partially weathered bedrock that sits well below the soil layer, but can contain a great deal of moisture that plants can tap during drought events in particular. So that rock moisture has been a very important, part of emerging theme in the critical zone observatories. So what can we say about the spatial distribution of this rock moisture and the other layer, the more permeable layer atop it, and how it varies across the landscape? So this was my conceptual model. In 2016, I wanted to put some numbers on the spatial variability of these layers, both in uplands and in lowlands. And so this, of course, involves a substantial amount of geologic input information. So I'm not going to go into all the details of this fairly busy slide, but the point is that we were using, in this effort, we were using global geologic data to identify relatively young deposits that may not be lithified. So these would be the thick sedimentary deposits of the Chaco foreland, for example, in the Andes, which represent a huge foreland basin deposit, thick deposit of relatively unconsolidated alluvial deposits in South America. And also we were including information on glacial cover. So in addition to basins and ranges representing lowlands and uplands, where I live in Arizona, we also have places formerly covered by the Laurentide and Fennoscandian ice sheets that are associated with tens of meters of thickness of glacial till and other drift products that need to be represented in this kind of an analysis. So we got into the details of global geologic maps with all of their uncertainties, together with the thickness of superficial deposits associated with glaciers and also aeolian deposits derived from glaciers. Focusing a little bit more on what we typically think of as critical zone science. This is on uplands now. We're looking at the climatic and topographic controls on soil thickness. So this is the depth to the paralithic contact, not the depth to fresh bedrock. And what we're looking at here is just data from the CONUS soil database out of Penn State. This is the average soil thickness as a function of hill slope curvature. So in this analysis, I took the global SRTM database and analyzed the whole land surface at 90-meter resolution, and I'm identifying some controls based on hill slope curvature. So from the upper left, the lower right, there's an increase in hill slope relief or curvature. Those two things go hand in hand, and that leads to a decrease in the average soil thickness down to something close to zero, which is high relief terrain. Climate also plays a role. So if you're in a more arid climate, you typically have a thinner soil, all else being equal, compared to a wetter climate. So this kind of data was used as input to a global map, again at 90-meter resolution, that predicted soil thickness across the globe. And so in this particular analysis, that calibration was based on US data, and it was applied it was validated to data from Europe. So there was no overlap whatsoever between the calibration data and the validation data. So the observed data for Europe is on top, and this is data that is in a classified form, 0 to 40 centimeters, 40 to 80 centimeters. And so that's how that data is collected in Europe and how it's aggregated. And so below is a prediction of using the same color scheme for what the soils should look like. So in this particular analysis, the soil thickness across Europe was predicted within a single thickness class in 82% of the time. So this is just one attempt, just an initial attempt to come up with a spatially variable representation of soil thickness. Again, as I said, one of the great discoveries of the critical zone observatory network is the is the fact that there is a lot of moisture held in rock tens of meters below the surface. And so one of the great contributions in this area is Rempe and Dietrich, 2014. And in this paper, they were arguing that the ultimate control, at least one of the controls on this depth to fresh bedrock, is really just the depth of the unsaturated zone, the vadose zone. So essentially, weathering cannot occur in areas that are perennially below the water table because of lack of oxygen and other things that facilitate weathering. You really need some wetting and drying to facilitate weathering. So what I did in this 2016 analysis was to take the Rempe and Dietrich model, or at least a version of that model, and couple it with global data from Yingfan Reinfelder and her colleagues that predict, using a dense global distribution of groundwater tables, that predict where the permanent water table is, and then that information was then used in conjunction with the conceptual model of Rempe and Dietrich to make a global prediction of the depth of fresh bedrock. And so I don't know if these data are validated to an extent in that paper, but additional testing needs to be made. You can see, I think, that my approach is to make a prediction, knowing that it's going to fail in some areas, but also knowing that the assumption of a globally uniform value is certainly not correct. And so any attempt, I think, to bring in some additional spatial distribution data to represent that heterogeneity of the landscape, as long as it's going in the right direction, I think it's a useful approach. So just a couple more points on that. Ultimately, any attempt to measure the thickness of these subsurface layers may be unsatisfactory. So in this first attempt, what I was really trying to do is to talk about, soil and then saprolite or intact regolith. But in fact, we know from many data sets that the distribution of, say, porosity and permeability, which is related to that, do have a more continuous distribution as you go from the surface to depth. And so this is an alternative conceptual model that I'm working on now of trying to characterize the variation in porosity as a function of depth. And in uplands, that porosity varies from maybe 0.4 to some value of a few percent when you get down into fresh bedrock over a length scale of a few tens of meters. And in the case of sedimentary basins, it's a similar kind of drop-off, except that it occurs over a much larger length scale, hundreds of meters, and in some extreme cases, maybe thousands of meters. So that compaction curve is fairly well known, and there's quite a bit of data. So a new alternative approach that I'm pursuing, and I'm sure other people are pursuing, is to try to characterize the subsurface architecture using these sort of common curves, and then just trying to calibrate and measure, estimate the length scales associated with these declines as a function of depth and how they vary across the landscape. So to do that, one approach is take P-wave velocity data, which is now being widely collected in uplands around the western United States. So this is St. Clair et al., 2015. Very successful paper to come out of the critical zone network, broadly speaking. And so they were measuring P-wave velocities and emphasizing the importance of topographic stress in the distribution of P-wave velocities. And so one can relate P-wave velocities, which vary from 0 to about, the speed of sound in air, roughly, basically, to about 5 kilometers per second in fresh bedrock. One can relate these via rock physics models to porosity and then therefore to permeability. So this is one attempt that I'm using currently to calibrate how porosity and permeability vary as a function of depth, is to use available seismic refraction models to make that connection via rock physics models. So this is my final slide. The main conclusion I hope that I've convinced some of you of is that there are opportunities for the critical zone community to couple both online and offline with Earth system modelers and Earth system models to forecast critical zone states and associated hazards out into the future. And this is just a partial list of some of the things that I think may be low-hanging fruit in this area. I've emphasized the lateral flow of groundwater and the spatial distribution of porosity and permeability that drives that or controls that lateral flow of groundwater. We need a better representation of those processes within our system models. There's no doubt about that. Sediment fluxes in rivers can be very important for biogeochemical cycling in wetlands and delta regions. So I think that's another need. Riverine and coastal flooding, landslides and post-wildfire debris flows are also would be useful to improve their process representations in these Earth system model frameworks. Land degradation, there are places where extreme gulling is taking place, primarily as a function of vegetation changes. Things like dune encroachment, we also need to take output from Earth system models and predict where dunes will advance over infrastructure. And then more generally, I think the role of soil carbon in the global carbon cycle is essential. So these are just some things that I've been thinking about with respect to some of the techniques that I've talked about in this series of slides. So thank you for your attention, and I'd like to open up to the discussion.
Thanks, Jon. So if anyone wants to ask a question, use your microphone icon in the bottom left, or dial *6 if you're dialed in.
Jon, this is Tim. I'll ask you a question.
Mm-hmm.
So you've talked to us about in your, throughout, but also in your concluding slide about the opportunities to couple with ESMs. And I'm just wondering if you've thought even broader than that about how the sort of work you've done and presented to us today could fit into GCMs.
Yeah, so I mean, it's just kind of a terminology issue, I think. So GCMs, are sort of the older. So general circulation model was, it was the acronym for a fully coupled climate model before land surface processes were included, starting maybe 15 or 20 years ago. So when land surface processes began to be included in what were then GCMs, they began to just a new terminology emerged, Earth system model. So it's really just the next generation of GCMs is ESMs, and I think that's what you're getting at, but let me know if I'm wrong there. But I think really they're one and the same. It's just that Earth system models are the next generation that explicitly include land surface processes as part of the fully coupled model.
All right. And I'll also ask, and again, I'm looking at your concluding slide, but I'm wondering, and you're presenting it at the end there of your conclusion, you say, and associated hazards, and you said that earlier in your talk too. And I'm just wondering if you've thought about it in terms of twisting it a little and presenting it in terms of critical zone services as opposed to hazards, and helping predict services.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, that's an excellent point. So I tend to think about it in terms of hazards, maybe just because it's kind of a holdover from being in the field for a couple of decades now. Being able to forecast, again, not predict when hazards will occur, but just the relative risk, whether the risk is going to go up or down in a changing world. I tend to think of it that way, but it's certainly broader than that. And it certainly can include things like, like the yields of agriculture and things like that are critical zone services. So yeah, I think maybe this is the focus on hazards is my particular bent, I suppose, because I'm interested in things that threaten lives in agriculture, things that threaten lives in infrastructure. But your point is well taken, that can be much broader to include critical zone services, which are not necessarily a threat to lives or infrastructure, but are just things that are produced by the critical zone that we need or that we benefit from in a variety of ways. But yeah, your point is well taken there. I guess the overall point is that Earth system models are very good. I mean, maybe a way to sort of frame this is that Earth system models are very good at predicting large-scale changes. Changes that are resolvable at a grid cell of 1 degree by 1 degree, which is traditionally where they've been at. Now they are improving dramatically in terms of their resolution and down to scales that we can really think about, not necessarily neighborhoods, but they're certainly scales that are single municipalities. And so when you're improving resolution in that way, you can certainly start to make site-specific predictions that of hazards or critical zone services more broadly, for where people live. So in the air quality, there's an analogy perhaps to be made with the air quality monitoring literature and efforts. So air quality has also, you can make a prediction about what a particular city like Phoenix will experience on a particular windy day, but there's a great deal of heterogeneity in that, and some of the heterogeneity has to do with whether you're downtown or which neighborhood you're in, and part of that has to do with the sheltering effect of the urban environment, which includes buildings of different heights, and part of it has to do with where the sources are. Phoenix is completely surrounded by farmland, it turns out, and also new construction, and both of those can act as sources. And so there's been an increasing interest on micro-scale assessments of air quality. And so that's kind of what I'm thinking about in terms of hazards. And it's one of the things I'm trying to emphasize here is that Earth system modeling it makes direct predictions about things that affect people's lives when in only a few cases. So if you're talking about heat waves, then obviously that's a very direct hazard that is associated with death, and it's a direct impact on human health and safety. And you don't necessarily need to, there's not a lot of spatial variation at 10-kilometer scale. I mean, if it's 125 degrees in a particular place, then that's what it is, and that's what you need to know. And so the probability of those events is directly an output of Earth system models. But there are a great many of other hazards that depend very sensitively on local soil conditions, local topographic conditions, local, proximity to dust sources and things like that, that really are at a 1-kilometer scale and even finer than that. So I think that in order for Earth system models to fully realize their potential for forecasting things that are really important to people who, of course, live within a couple of meters of the surface. That's where all our air is breathed. That's where all our food is grown, right? It's within a fairly narrow range vertically. We really do need to understand the site-specific conditions, and that gets at the whole issue of heterogeneity and how things vary across the Earth, and how we as critical zone scientists can say something about that heterogeneity, about its distribution, and how it's controlled by climate and geology, et cetera, and use those to better inform our system models, and also both offline and online, as I emphasized. So, but your point is well taken that critical zone services, there's a natural link here for sure.
Does anyone else have a question? Because if not, I'm going to ask one more.
Or a comment. You can also just tell me that I'm full of BS or whatever. Not everyone agrees with this type of theme, so a comment is also welcome, of course. Well,
so John, and please, if anyone has a question, just interrupt, because I don't want to hog his time. But so in last spring, so 2016, Tess Russo at Penn State and a couple other people made a compilation of all the models that are being used and applied at the CZOs. And it's actually quite an impressive list. And so I'm just curious if you'd care to comment on, what's the next step? We've got all these people using this array of models to work on some aspect of the critical zone, but how do we now organize, other than individually moving forward, how could we as a community do what you're showing us or telling us about in your conclusion, that there are opportunities to couple? How do we get everybody to do that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I guess to me, it is, I think that as someone who's been thinking about this, I would say that, I don't think it's beyond the scope of the critical zone observatory network, which does have a history, and I think perhaps originally had a mandate from NSF to some extent to observe, to actually make in situ measurements at a watershed scale, and that was the emphasis, and that remains the emphasis, and there's nothing wrong with that. I do think so that puts somewhat of a limit on what we can do. I do think that there have been model coupling frameworks and systems that have been developed, not necessarily across critical zone communities, but maybe within certain communities that can be replicated. So here I would say that systems, which is based out of UC Boulder and run by Jim Svitsky and others, has done a very nice job at asking the geomorphic community, and really any community that has some input to geomorphology, which includes, of course, all of hydrology and all of ecology, and so on, to make model components available that are actually designed in a way that they can be coupled easily. So there is a best practices for how you produce a component model that can be easily coupled with other component models. And the ultimate product of that is really LandLab, which was again developed out of the systems framework, and is a modular landscape evolution model. And so that approach is allowing, I think, folks to couple things, couple processes in the critical zone that haven't traditionally been coupled before, and come up with new and interesting feedbacks. And so I think that modular design can be useful. I don't think it's necessarily the only way to approach these these very complicated multidisciplinary multi-process problems, but I think modularity in code design is certainly one way to do it, and has been very successful in, as evidenced by LandLab. And so LandLab is primarily geomorphic in nature, but there's no reason why, the best practices involved in making your code modular to fit within LandLab is quite generic for surface and subsurface processes. And also above ground processes. One can couple atmospheric boundary layer models, for example, with sand saltation models within LandLab. As far as I'm aware, that capability exists. So I think that LandLab and the general idea of model coupling through particular, by following a particular protocol for coding is one way to facilitate this. Ultimately, I think, as a PI in the critical zone, in one critical zone observatory, where the funding is spread in many, many ways, I found my own, what was realistic for me, I do modeling myself, and I try to make those component models available to other people within systems. But what was practical for me was to pick a particular theme that was emergent within the network, and the theme that I chose was slope aspect. So I was very interested in the fact that topographic slopes are systematically steeper on north-facing slopes relative to south-facing slopes, or rather pole-facing slopes relative to equator-facing slopes on most of the Earth. But then if you go above a certain elevation, it actually switches around and you get steeper south-facing slopes relative to north-facing slopes. And so there's a pattern in the landscape, there's a very common pattern in the landscape that is also associated with patterns in vegetation and patterns in solar radiation. Ultimately, this is what I'm describing here. Slope aspect controls and critical zone processes are the result of feedbacks within the critical zone involving hydrology and vegetation and landscape development, landform development, that are influenced by geographic patterns of solar radiation, which are basically latitudinal in nature. So that was a really cool idea to me, and I wanted to explore that using both data and models. And so we got a group of people together, as you know, about a year ago. And so there's a review paper in the works, in review right now on that subject. But So that was an opportunity to do some model coupling and to take some models, and so that was an exercise in model intercomparison. So folks brought to that exercise. There was a land lab example, and there was also an example from a couple of other landscape evolution models that do things in a slightly different way. So I think those kinds of model intercomparison exercises can be very useful, where you bring people together to attack a single problem, because you can learn a great deal about how the models vary. There are strengths and weaknesses of models that have been developed independently, of course. And so you can do best practices or develop some best practices that way by attacking a single problem. And also the modularity. You know, if you design models to be modular, then certainly they're of greater use by the rest of the community. You know, I mean, I hesitate to say that's the only way to do modeling, because there are still a lot of people doing really cool work using non-modular codes that they've developed and that, you know, are shared but are not made to be as user-friendly as, say, something like LandLab. But in any case, LandLab is a great example of something that's broadly usable by the community and can be, you know, every time someone adds an additional module, it opens up a whole new dimension of what can be done with the model system, you know. So I think that there's actually a lot of success. There are examples of success within the broader community, you know, that includes folks like Greg Tucker and Nicole Gasparini, who are either involved in the Critical Zone Observatory Network, or they're one step removed, right? And so I think that, you know, for me, what's been successful is to attack a particular pattern in data using coupled models. And that doesn't get us to one big mega model. And I don't know if we need to get there. I mean, I guess we'll get there eventually, but I think it's going to take decades, and I think it's going to be a little longer in time scale and larger in funding than what we have, you know, as part of just the model component of the CZOs. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Does anyone have any questions?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
All right, very good. So I'm Zach Breckheisen. I work at the Calhoun CZO. And so I got real excited just a moment ago when you were talking about landscape patterning with slope and aspect. That's not what my question is about, but that's just to kind of preface it that I find that extremely fascinating, the idea that there's a little bit of a structure here that we can try to tease apart, and I'll probably shoot you a couple of emails to follow up with it. But thinking about at the scale of hill slopes and whatnot, watershed scales, you talked about and had some slides on how you kind of did a 3D or 3 dimensions, applying kind of the Rempe-Dietrich conceptual model to look at the depth to fresh bedrock. And then we're talking about the work that like St. Clair and the Holbrook group have done. And I'm wondering if you have kind of tried to check, or if you've done work in using data from some of the same areas that the Holbrook team have done their kind of 2D planar work with, to check it against your more 3-dimensional fresh bedrock exercises.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so essentially the I think it's fair to say that the paper that I'm describing, where that model work was done, so there's a published version, and then there's the stuff that I alluded to that I'm currently working on, which is the more continuous distribution of porosity and permeability with depth. I think that the influence of St. Clair and Holbrook is going to be more on the newer work, the latter work, because, and I also have some of my own. It won't be based exclusively on their seismic refractions, although they do it the best in the world. But, you know, we have some independent seismic refraction data from the Jemez Mountains, for example, which provides some additional data for understanding that porosity is a function of depth using seismic refraction, and how the functional form of that relationship. In the earlier data that the data that's currently available is data from a paper in 2016. So this is the Journal of the Advances in, so it's James, which is Journal of the Advances in Modeling of the Earth System. And in that, so that was at a time when just sort of the work was done in 2015. So it was done a little bit before St. Clair and a little bit after Rempe and Dietrich. And so I was heavily influenced by Rempe and Dietrich in that work. And so I think that to the extent that water table depth is ultimately a limiting factor on how deep the regolith can become, I think that model is realistic and you can look at that paper to decide for yourself whether the validation of that model against data is good or not. But I think in the more recent work that I'm describing, it's going to bring in the topographic stress model in an explicit way, and is going to involve data that's been collected from the CZO network that includes topographic stress, and it includes the patterns, the qualitative patterns at the very least that St. Clair et al. Have developed. So I guess my thinking is evolving, and in published work from 2016, it's really more based on Rempe and Dietrich. But I think we've learned that the world is a combination of those two controls, and so moving forward, it should honor both of those models.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd be happy to follow up by email, of course. It'd be great.
Any other questions? Well, John, we're a little over an hour, and I just want to thank you very much. It was very informative and enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim and Sarah.
Thank you, John.
All right. Guys, have a good day. All right.